Today we are interviewing A. Michael Beaird, now retired, who was the director of the Law Library and associate professor of law at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock from 1998 until 2007. He was named associate professor of law emeritus upon retirement. Prior to his appointment at Arkansas, Mike, as he prefers to be called, served as a law librarian positions at the Universities of Houston and Mississippi before becoming the vice president of Butterworth Publications, a position he held from 1982 until 1997. Following his retirement from Arkansas Little Rock, Mike served as interim director at the University of Nevada at Las Vegas and as interim associate vice chancellor, in other words, law library director, at Louisiana State University. Mike, let's begin with a little personal history. Can you tell us about where you were raised and about your family and life, both then and today?
Pat, thank you very much. I was raised in Lufkin, a small town in East Texas, about 100 miles north of Houston. And I was the sixth child and the fourth son of the family. I was the baby. And we were first generation college. My brothers and I were the first ones to go to college. And I grew up in Lufkin, joined the Navy right out of high school, and then came out and worked my way through the University of Texas. So that's where I was raised. One additional thing is my father was a magazine distributor. He worked for a magazine distributor. So beside our house there was a panel truck that belonged to his boss, and that panel truck was full of pocketbooks, books, and magazines. So I kind of grew up out there in that truck. This is relevant because I became a librarian.
It's interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about the degrees you have and where you earned them?
Well, I worked my way through the University of Texas pretty much on my own. Graduated in 1969. I worked as a postman mostly. Also worked in a hospital as a boiler repairman, boiler repair and maintenance repair. And so I worked my way through the University of Texas, and then I worked for 2 years as a salesman, a textbook sales rep, which is again relevant to becoming a librarian. So I was a book salesman. And then I decided to go to law school, and the company that I worked for in publishing was Richard Irwin, and they moved me to Oklahoma. They said I could live anywhere I wanted. I chose to live in Norman, a college town. So a year and a half later I decided to go to law school, and OU, College of Law, was just a few blocks away. So that's why I went to law school at OU. And from there to the University of Washington. And I think we'll come back and talk a little bit more about law school experience.
Well, you've got your law degree and law librarianship degree from the University of Washington, the latter being from that. Could you talk a little bit about some of the aspects of your long career in law librarianship? But it sort of begin by talking about whether how you happened to become a law librarian. Did someone play a role in recruiting you into this field, or did you come about it through some other means?
Well, actually, that actually started when I went to law school. First of all, I was 31 years old, and most of my law school classmates were younger. Some were the same age, but mostly younger. And of course, in those days, as everyone of my generation will remember, there were no computers. So all the books in the law library were print. Everything was print. So you had to do research in print. And the first class, one of the first classes, was called legal bibliography. And we were assigned to go find cases. And for example, I remember the dog catcher case in Iowa in 1917. Go find it. What's the name of it? Cite it correctly. Well, my classmates, they couldn't understand how those books worked, but it was easy for me. I don't know why it was easy for me, but it was very easy for me because this set of books took you to here, and then this set took you to there. And my classmates said, well, how did you do that? How did you know to go there? And I said, well, it's obvious, those books work this way. And they said, no, it's not obvious. And I said, well, it was obvious to me. So 6 weeks into law school, no more than 6 weeks into law school, my classmates said to me, you should be a librarian because you understand how these books work. Well, a few months later, a faculty member, not one who I ever had a class from, but a faculty member at OU Law, a friend of mine, he was my neighbor, he suggested that I look into it, and so I did. And while I was in law school, I worked in the library. I took a course, I took the reference course at the library school at Oklahoma, trying to decide if that's what I wanted to do. And so I took that class. I also went to a regional law library meeting, the Southwestern Association, SWAL, and the meeting was in Santa Fe. And I met law librarians, many law librarians. And then I also went to the annual meeting, which was held in Seattle in 1973, the summer of '73. And of course I was finishing my second year of law school. And at the AALL meeting, I met Marion Gallagher. It was in Seattle. So I went over to the library school and went to the law school, and I met Marion and talked to people. And here, of course, again, I was older. I was 33. And that's what decided me to go. And Jim Hoover, who was in the class ahead of me at OU Law, had decided to go to the University of Washington program. And so that was also instrumental. But all of these things combined to lead me to UW. And of course, in those days, there were usually 3 or 4 people in a class, sometimes as few as 2. Rarely was there only one. But in my class, in that class of 1975, it was Marion Gallagher and me. There was no one else there. So when she asked a question, I had no place to hide. I pulled some all-nighters because I didn't want to say, I don't know, and I never did. So I sat in her office, and it was quite an experience, and I really felt fortunate to have her attention focused on me. So that's how that came about.
Well, it's interesting. I went through the same program as you did, and there were initially 4 of us who were her students, and then one dropped out, so left 3. So I did have people to hide behind, although I guess she didn't allow any of us to get away with that anyhow, so I'm not sure you were at a disadvantage or an advantage one way or the other. I think it's the way she conducted the classes.
Well, she did allow, Jane Stewart was one of the first law firm librarians in Seattle. Mm-hmm. And she had graduated from library school, not the law library program, but the regular library degree, a couple of years before. And so she asked Marion if she could audit. And so Jane actually sat in a couple of my classes. So the truth was I wasn't completely alone, but I felt like I was alone because I was the only degree student. Mm-hmm. So, and then there was one other lady from Oregon who sat in on one of the classes. But I felt like I was just Marion and myself. So I felt that pressure, which I accepted. So.
Well, apparently you survived it in good stead, because as I recall, you succeeded me at the University of Houston by several years. We sort of had the same job there.
Yes.
You want to talk a little bit about your very early career at Houston and Mississippi?
Well, I grew up there just 100 miles from Houston, and I was actually, while I was in library school, in those days, as Pat remembers, with that degree, you were very often offered a director's job, and I was offered Tulsa as the director. And now, mind you, the only job that I'd done at that point was a student, a reference assistant, or working the desk, or filing loose leaves. So I just didn't think I should be the director right out of law school, right out of library school. I was wrong. I would have done fine. I would have done well, but that's what I thought. There was also the geography, the family, the history. So Houston, Lolly Gassaway was then the director at University of Houston, and she offered me the job, and so I took that and moved home to Texas for me, home. And I was at Houston for a couple of years. I taught my first class there. It was one class and not the whole semester. I wasn't responsible for the entire semester, just the class for 2. And that was the first time I'd ever taught anything, and that was an interesting experience. I was a little nervous until I started talking, and then it went away. I was never had any problem talking in front of a class again. So then Ole Miss happened to be roll up the dice next, and I was offered the director's job, and so I moved to Oxford, and I was there for 5 years as director. John Grisham was in the first class I taught there, which has caused some interesting stories to be told through the years. He was in that class. He, of course, was not famous. Didn't become famous until later. But so anyway, I was at Ole Miss for 5 years. I was up. I would have been up for tenure, but I left before that happened because I responded to an advertisement, and that's what led me to the change in my career, which is unusual.
Certainly wasn't unusual, at least as far as I have seen other colleagues, because you began your career in a fairly traditional fashion, like many of us, but unlike most of us, then in 1982, you moved into a position at Butterworth Publishing. Eventually, you came full circle back around and returned to the more traditional approach, first as the assistant at St. John's in Queens, and then later as the director at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. Could you talk a little bit about some of those experiences, and particularly, Mike, maybe focus a bit on some of the things you were involved in and saw when you were working for the publishing world?
It was a very interesting way that it happened. One little digression, I was offered the job, while I was at Ole Miss, I was offered the job as director of the library at the State Law Library in Austin. Marion Boner had preceded, in fact she was the founding librarian there, and that was the job I wanted. That was always the job I wanted. And I interviewed for that job in the summer of '81, and I was offered the job, but it didn't pay enough. I couldn't, my wife at the time had started her PhD program at Ole Miss, and I couldn't move to Texas and leave the family, and so I turned the job down. And almost simultaneously, the Butterworth job came along. There was an ad in the Texas Bar Journal. I had taken the Texas bar, so I'm licensed in Texas. I never practiced, but I'm licensed. And so here was an ad. They wanted someone with legal publishing, or with publishing experience. I'd been a textbook sales rep, legal training, preferably a law degree I had, and the ambition to start a publishing company from scratch in Texas. So it was a chance to go home. And I was enthused by the idea. I got the job. I flew home. I flew to Austin, started the company. My family joined me a few months later. So I started a company from scratch. And Butterworth Legal Publishers in the U.S., their idea was to publish at the local level, which was different than most of the national publishers. That's another thing I should mention. Legal publishing at that time in the 70s, there were 20, 30, 35, 40, I don't know how many, national legal publishers. Now there's 3, actually there's 4 if you count B&A. But in those days there were a lot of small national publishers, small in the scheme of things. They all got absorbed by the three big ones that survived. But anyway, Butterworth's idea was to publish at the local level. So that's why I went to Texas. Texas had a big bar population, and they could support, there were enough lawyers to support a publishing program. So that's what I did. I started up a publishing program in Texas. I also published books in Oklahoma and Louisiana, one in Missouri, and bought some books in New Mexico and published books there as well. So eventually, the industry consolidated. The legal publishers, Thompson, now doing business as Thomson Reuters, wound up buying, first of all, Lawyers Co-op, and then West. Reed Elsevier established Butterworth, but wound up buying several smaller publishers, but they also bought Lexis. And then Wolters Kluwer, a Dutch company, wound up buying most of the rest. So all those 25 or 30 publishers are now within the sphere of those three major. When I was teaching at Little Rock, I called those three the three gorillas because they dominate legal publishing. Really two, but Wolters Kluwer is the third. And now B&A has been absorbed by Bloomberg. I think that's right. But anyway, so that was the thing. What I saw during those 15 years that I was in publishing from 82 to 97 when I went to St. John's, the industry consolidated. All those publishers were bought up by the three big ones, now three big ones. One of the reasons that I got the job, though, the man who hired me at Butterworth saw that my library background would stand them in good stead in publishing in the United States. And so he sent me to the law library meetings, and he made sure that I maintained my relationships with the law librarians all across the country. And I had met and knew quite a few. So he made it a point to be sure that I maintained my contacts, and that was beneficial to Butterworth. I know that it was. Eventually, after mergers, Butterworth wound up buying Lexis, and Butterworth U.S. Legal wound up being merged into the Mickey Company in Charlottesville. And so from there, it was time for me to make a change. And so I went back to being a librarian, and I was the associate director at St. John's. And there's an interesting phenomenon about academic library directors, law library directors, that I want to make this point. It's almost impossible to get the director's job unless you're presently in academia. You can't come from outside. You can't be a court librarian, a firm librarian, or anything else and be appointed as the director of a law school library. My life in the law library world goes now 35 plus years, and there's only been about 15 or so times that somebody did that. Penny Hazelton was the director of the library at the Supreme Court of the U.S., moved to the director's job. Jim Heller was the federal librarian, federal agency librarian, and went to Idaho. And there's about 10 or 12 other examples. But there's nobody, well, there's one who became a director again after having been in publishing besides me, and that was Marion Parker. But it's very unusual to be, and so that's why I went to St. John's. I had to go and sort of get cleansed in order to be the director again after Ole Miss and then publishing. The only way I could get to be a director was to go and be the associate. St. John's, the dice rolled up St. John's, and that's why I was at St. John's. And then I got the director's job at Little Rock and wound up retiring from there.
Now, it's interesting, Mike, in that when you first were graduating from the program at the University of Washington, you were offered a directorship at Tulsa, as I recall.
Right.
Now, I remember at the same time, since we're more or less contemporaries, that this was not uncommon. A number of her students and people who had come through other avenues into the profession moved into directorships immediately out of school. You and I opted to, do it a little differently and get some other experience under a mentor. In your case, Lolly Gassaway, who's gone on to mentor quite a few other directors over the years, as she explains a bit in her own interview for this program that we conducted a few weeks back.
Yes.
And she's very proud of that experience, and rightly so. But yet, then later when you changed to something that was not the tradition, you moved into publishing, you were in fairly significant positions with Butterworth. I mean, you were the head person of some of its operations. And
That's correct.
these were not positions where, you know, it would obviously be someone that they would take who lacked quite a bit of ability. And yet when you came back out, you were not able to find a directorship initially. I think you went to work with Barney Reams, was it?
Barney Reams was
Yeah.
the director at St. John's.
Yeah.
In fact, when I first planned to do it, to go back to being a director, Marion Parker was at Lexus at the time, and she had been the director at Tulsa, coincidentally. And she and I were talking, and there were 5 jobs. This was in 1990 when I first started thinking about it. And there were 5 jobs open that year: Oklahoma, Kentucky, and I've forgotten what, 2 or 3 others. And I wrote letters. And I had been the director at Ole Miss for 5 years, and I had a good degree. So I thought, you know, I could be the director again. It didn't happen. I couldn't even get an interview. And no one would even invite me to interview. And that's when I found out. I figured, Marion and I concluded that you have to go and you have to be in academia. It happens a few times, but it was pretty unusual. So, as I mentioned earlier, Marion eventually became the director again at Wake Forest, and I'm not sure if she's still there or if she has retired. No, I don't know.
I don't remember.
I think she's still there. But anyway, it was really difficult to get the job as director unless you were in an academic situation. Now, I've also realized in later years now that it's also true for firm librarians. You can't jump from a law school environment into being the director of a huge law firm library. These career paths have become more compartmentalized than they were when you and I were young, Pat. Carl Grubin is an exception that comes to mind. He was Vincent Elkins, and then he went to be the director of the firm manager, the law firm manager in Cleveland, and then he became the director of an academic library at St. Thomas in Florida, and now he's at San Diego. That's unusual. Carl had an unusual path in what he did. He was, in fact, I don't think he was ever an academic librarian until he got the job at St. Thomas. That's pretty unusual.
Well, I suppose deans are concerned about this is a pretty key appointment in their operations, and they would like someone with a fairly recent track record of excellence doing pretty much the same kind of work.
And faculty. I think the Faculty Appointments Committee, I think they operate under the assumption that what could he know? In my case, I've always said, I've always laughingly said I was a third-level schmuck in a publishing company. Why would they hire me as director? Well, you know, eventually that's why I had to go to St. John's.
Well, I remember when I was retiring, I'd given almost a year's notice to the dean, as is appropriate given the position I have. And I remember some of the discussions in the faculty about the criteria that they would like to see in my successor. And not only did they assume it would be someone who had been a director someplace, they also went on to suggest that it would have to be a directorship at a more prestigious as opposed to a lesser ranked school. So I suppose, you know, as you say, our faculty colleagues sort of take into account the same sorts of things that they take into account for faculty hires to normal teaching positions.
Yes.
Same kind of thing. How different it is since you and I first started.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Came out of school and there were directorships dangled in our available.
Another thing that was common when you and I were pups, when we were puppies, is that there were still quite a few directors who didn't have a law degree.
Oh, I remember that.
They were the standard, I think, changed sort of about that time. So the accrediting standards strongly suggested, and I think later did require, that the director have both degrees. and both degrees are credited.
Yeah.
But at the time when we started, there were a number of directors who didn't have the law degree. Arkansas, SMU, those come to mind immediately. And there were others, Baylor, I'm sure there are many others.
And there were a number of directors who had law degrees but did not have library degrees. My director at Yale, when I worked there, Art Charpentier, was an example. And
Ed Schroeder, I think, I'm not sure Ed Schroeder ever had a library degree.
Yeah. And not too many years prior to that, many of the people that we were replacing had come into the library they started working there. They didn't have any particular academic pedigree, and yet they learned it as they worked there over a number of years. So there were a lot of changes occurring, mostly perhaps a bit before our days, probably more in the 1950s when people with academic backgrounds became much more the norm for appointments to...
Well, when you graduated from UW, Pat, you were the first second degree, double degree at Houston. And just a few years later, I was, again, the only second degree, second double degree.
That's right. Yeah.
And now every law school has, if they have 8 librarians, 6 of them have both degrees.
Yeah.
So it's quite common now.
Well, of course, the number of people in law schools and in the legal profession has tremendously increased over the years we were active, and I suppose not everybody wants to do what is the tradition for practicing law. There are alternatives, and I know I thoroughly enjoyed the work I did at American University, and before that as well. I thought it was very challenging and very rewarding in all the right senses of that term.
I agree completely. When I went to law school, the idea was I was going to be a lawyer. I didn't even know there was such a thing as a law librarian. But then, my classmates and I excelled at that course. I didn't do so well in the rest of the courses in law school. Did okay, but not as well. But the library world it seemed meant for me, and it worked out well.
Well, I want to thank you, Mike Beaird, for allowing us to visit with you today, and for taking these few moments to share so much about yourself and about our profession. Before closing, however, it is my custom to give the person being interviewed the last word. So is there anything that you would like to add before we conclude?
Well, for those who see this, I just wish you well. You're obviously a student of the law library world, and I wish you well. And I've had great fun in my later years trying to be a mentor myself to the younger librarians. I'll mention 2 specifically. Vicente Filou is now the director at Villanova, and I had the occasion to work with him during my last stop, which was at LSU. And now Philip Gregg is now the director at the new law school in Boise, Concordia, and he also, I worked with him at LSU. So it's been fun being at the other end of this mentoring process as the years came on. And I'm happily retired, but look fondly back on having been a law librarian. It was a good career.
Well, thank you again, Mike, for being part of this today's interview and for being part of our project. I think, as you say, a lot of students may view these recordings, but I suspect a few of the rest of us will as well. Having conducted a number of them now, it's really fascinating to learn about our colleagues, and they talk about their stories, and we're all a little bit different, and yet there's a certain sameness to it, and I find them very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat.